Well, it's great to be here again. This is the third talk I've done to this group. It's always nice to be here, and I always feel very beautifully received. So thank you to Rhonda and to Jane, who isn't here at the moment, and and Dave and Rob and all the gang. Much appreciated. So today I've got a talk which is based on my latest book, which is all to do with solutions to the debt-based financial system. So we're going to talk about that. Now, there'll be stuff in my talk today that I would imagine most of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with. Please bear with me and take it as an opportunity to imbibe information that will help you, hopefully, to put this across to other people. Because what I found with this topic is that whereas most people, in the normie world, if you like, are very shut down on certain topics and very reluctant to go there, particularly on climate change, which I've been absolutely Mr. Controversial on that topic, as I'm sure a lot of us have. With this topic, I find that everybody knows they're being shafted, but they don't know quite how it all works. And my experience is that people are much more curious and willing to hear what you've got to say. So when you've got that more receptive audience, if you like, how do you put it across? And this is something that's explainable. The nub of it is explainable in a few minutes, really. So anyway, hopefully you'll have some, as well as learning some new stuff and getting some insight on this topic, which I hope you will do, you'll also hopefully get some tools as to how to, as I say, enlighten other people about the topic. But ultimately, what's this all about? It's not just talking about the problem, it's talking about the solutions, of course. This is very much solutions orientated. So we're going to look at the story of the Bradbury Pound, which my co-author Justin Walker is a particular expert on and has done a lot of research into. We're going to look at decentralised solutions, generally creating a parallel society, what that means, and also looking at the idea of a gift economy, which is a moneyless society. Right, which one is it? There we go. So really this encompasses it all in a way. This lovely quote of Jimi Hendrix: "When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace." And it's as simple as that, really. And here's what we're going to be doing and are doing, which is breaking the shackles that we have. And to set the scene again, here we've got a quote from William Patterson, who was the co-founder of the Bank of England in 1694. He was a buccaneer, a slave owner and slave trader, and this is what he said, and it encompasses really the whole thing in a nutshell. "The Bank of England hath benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing." Doesn't that say it all? And here's Reginald McKenna in 1924, who'd been a sort of top-level banker and then became Chancellor of the Exchequer for a time. "I'm afraid that the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can and do create and destroy money. And they who control the credit of a nation, direct the policy of governments, and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." So, some people that I wish to thank to begin with now. Justin Walker, as I say, he's done a vast amount of research on this topic. He's an activist and he's my co-author. James Corbett of the Corbett Report, an independent journalist. If you've not checked him out, I highly recommend all the work he's doing. He's got some fantastic documentaries, amongst other things, does regular videos and so on. Very solutions orientated. John Hamer, I don't know whether he's ever given a talk here. He's the author of the 2-volume Behind the Curtain, a chilling expose of the banking industry, which goes into a lot more detail in the history of the banking industry and so on. Very, both about this thing. And the makers of the Money Masters documentary, which came out in 1996, but is still a highly recommended documentary. It's at least 3.5 hours long, and it goes from the beginning of money right through to the modern day, and goes through. I mean, particularly from an American perspective, but it certainly talks about the world situation as well. And I've got links to that in my book. Charles Eisenstein, author of Sacred Economics. He's particularly inspirational for me in relation to the gift economy, which I mentioned earlier, and just generally friends and family for their support. So what's the overview here? The overview is that money is created out of thin air by private central bankers and then loaned to nations at interest, creating national debt, inflation, and resulting in the siphoning off of much of the world's wealth to a small number of greedy, power-hungry individuals. This is the basis of the slave system we're in. Simple as that. We're going to get more into the detail of this. This is just a sort of the overview, as I say. And then part of that is what's called fractional reserve banking, which means whenever you take out a loan from a bank, such as a mortgage, this is when it comes to an individual level rather than a sort of governmental level, if you like. Rather than the bank giving you some of its own capital, your signature actually creates the money. And then it does a double accounting process in its ledger, which is simply, fraud. If we did that in our accounts, we'd be done for fraud, wouldn't we? But the banks do that every day. And then the person who's taken out the loan, which is, the money is created by their signature, it's their money, they're given the money, but then they have to pay it back at interest. As I say, this is quite simply fraud. And as I'm sure you're all aware, we've now got this move to create a cashless society by bringing in central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, such as the digital pound in this country, which would result in the bankers having total control over our lives. We can see how the City of London is the real power behind the UK Parliament, and we're going to look particularly at this story of how the UK Treasury actually issued sovereign money in 1914, which was nicknamed the Bradbury Pound, to avert economic collapse just prior to the First World War, taking printing and control of money in Britain out of the hands of central bankers for the first time in centuries. So it did actually happen for a time. We can see how sovereign money leads to prosperity, peace, cultural enrichment, full employment and zero inflation. So bringing back the Bradbury Pound would bring about these positive effects once again for the British economy and people. Beyond that, which is more of a sort of centralised solution, if you like, sovereign money solution, can be either regional or countrywide. Then we've got decentralised solutions, which cover things particularly such as barter, precious metals, truly decentralised and democratic. Oh, where's Dave gone? Is it just because...
What have you done?
I haven't touched it. Oh, it's come back.
Well done, Dave.
Yeah, well done, Dave. So, decentralised solutions, barter, precious metals, truly decentralised and democratic cryptocurrencies. I'm certainly not an expert on cryptocurrencies, but I get the impression that there are some that are a bit less than decentralised and democratic. We've got local exchange trading schemes, or LETS schemes, and then once again also looking at a moneyless society based on generosity. And I'm going to encourage all of you to be thinking about creating a parallel society, which is creating local systems to meet our needs, including, of course, in this case, means of exchange, and building resilience. That's the key thing, building resilience, running alongside the mainstream existing systems. And this is my call to you. Let's break the shackles of the slave system we're in, take back our power, and come together in love and open-heartedness to be the guardian stewards of an abundant, thriving, beautiful earth. It's all there for us if we choose to step into that reality. So what's Justin's story? So his uncle was Lord Pilkington, and he actually attended the first Bilderberg Group meeting in 1954 and was a director of the Bank of England from 1955 to 1972. So absolutely, someone very much at the top of the financial pyramid, in Britain at least. Now, Justin himself joined the Ecology Party in 1978, which later became the Green Party, and served on the party council for 10 years. So he was around in the Ecology Party at the time, the time David Icke was involved, for example. Anyway, Justin left the party in 1992, having realised the real truth was not being told, by the Green Party. Now, his uncle, while he was still alive, had already told Justin that the City of London actually controlled Parliament, but Justin really didn't know much more about the money system in his earlier days. But when he learnt the truth about money creation and money supply, that shifted his priorities, and he started doing a lot of research into this topic. And this all particularly came about, I think it's probably going to keep doing that. This particularly came about when he had what he calls his Richard Hannay moment in 2012. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, he gets this phone call from a guy who doesn't know, who says that he's, let's just see if we can improve that at all. Yes, well, it might just keep coming on and off. We'll just have to wait and see. So he gets this. Justin gets this phone call from a guy who says he's the son of somebody who was a director of the Bank of England at the same time as his uncle served there. But this old chap was now dying, and the dying man wanted to pass on essential information which had been deliberately kept secret from the British people. And what he was told was that this was quite simply the big secret that would be the solution to all of Britain's economic woes. And then he was told, research Bradbury. And that was the only thing he was given, Bradbury. And the phone went dead at that point. Well, Justin's thinking, Bradbury, what's that all about? I've no idea. So he started researching, and it took him a little while before he actually came across the story of the Bradbury Pound. And that led on to him doing 10 years of extensive research, including talking to insiders, because of his family links, he had sort of access to these type of people. So let's have a look at the debt-based money system. How the money system works is deliberately obscured. We're kept in the dark as to who gets to print money, the basis of the financial system, and thus the basis of political power. So everybody out there has this vague impression, which is never said explicitly in the news, but is conveyed somehow, and vaguely, that the Bank of England is somehow part of the state or the government. It might be a bit hived off from the government, and there's a bit of separation between the government and the Bank of England. But the Prime Minister appoints the Governor of the Bank of England. and it's supposedly nationalised and all of this thing, and all this sort of thing. All you need to say to people to shatter that vague understanding is, did you know that the Bank of England is actually a private institution? Private? Really? What does that mean? That means that it's not at all part of the government or the state. It has shareholders who are secret. We don't know who they are because the Bank of England was created by Royal Charter in 1694. It's not an ordinarily registered company where you'd know the directors. And what the purpose of the Bank of England is to create profit for the shareholders. It's not at all to serve the interests of the British people. And of course this money system is totally based on debt, and it's owed to these private bankers. We've got the UK national debt. I mean, it's probably already gone up since then, since this figure, but it's roughly about £2.5 trillion, and that's owed to these private bankers. So every man, woman and child in the UK, even if they think they haven't got a credit card bill, they haven't got a mortgage, but no, they're still in debt to the private bankers, and that debt is forever increasing. We've got this privately owned Bank of England. What do? Well, as the quote from William Patterson says, they print money out of nothing and then lend it to the government in interest. So how bizarre is that? So they just, create something out of nothing and then say to the government, right, here's your money that you can put into circulation to get the economy going, but you've got to give that money back to us at interest. So why doesn't the government just print its own money? In which case it would then be a sovereign nation. And now at the moment it's not, it's beholden to the Bank of England, which is the same with most countries in the world, which all have privately owned central banks. There's very few that don't. So who are the real power in the world? Of course, it's the bankers. And they don't create wealth, they take wealth. So how do you pay this money back? The government's taken out these government bonds, which are the loans. How do they pay it back? Well, either they borrow more money from the Bank of England to pay back the original debt, or they tax us. Yeah? And it's no coincidence that when the Federal Reserve Act in the US was created, and finally created the long-standing private central bank in the US, at the same time the Inland Revenue Service was set up in America, because at that time the federal government had very little income or outgoings because it didn't need it. But all of a sudden, once the Federal Reserve was set up and the government was starting to owe lots of money to the Federal Reserve, they needed to get that money from somewhere. Well, they shafted everybody they creamed all that money off through taxes to pay it back to the central bankers. So that's how it works. And here we go. Master Amstel Rothschild, founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, said in 1790, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." They do have control of the money, and which means we're all hostages to the bankers, and they have complete control over the economic life of the people. So there's actually nothing wrong with money as a means of exchange. If it's simply there to facilitate trade, to facilitate economic activity, that's fine. But the problems arise when we have usury, which is the charging interest on money. In other words, making money itself a commodity and profiting from it. And then we've got this whole fractional reserve banking, which means the fraud that we've talked about. And essentially what that means is the bankers are leechers, constantly siphoning wealth out of the real economy and into their pockets. This is actually how inflation comes about. Well, this is not talked about in Question Time on the TV, or, again, we're just given this vague impression that, well, inflation is just part of the system, and we try and direct it through interest rates and all this sort of thing. well, actually, there wouldn't be any inflation if we set the system up properly, so we don't owe all this money and we're at the beholden to the private bankers. And it's also how the cycles of boom and bust come about. So let's see what James Madison, the US president in the early 19th century, said. History records that the money changers, in other words the bankers, have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. And then what did Henry Ford say? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of him, the big car manufacturing chappie. It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. So let's have a revolution, guys. So, yeah, where does this all lead, really? Let's look at the bigger picture of this. So just to give a bit of a flavour of this, we can look at a report by Oxfam in 2020 which said that the world's 2,000 and so billionaires have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the world's population. So we get this vast difference in wealth between the small number of people at the top and the vast majority of people at the bottom of the wealth pyramid. And then, just to confirm this immoral situation, we've got just 2 private asset management companies, BlackRock and Vanguard, who control and own almost all of the major corporations on Earth. So the centralisation of power, the centralisation of money and control is very, very much a reality. And, you know, while this few enjoy unbelievable wealth and power, well, just to give a small example, you know, it's a big example, but it's one example of many. We've got millions of children working in sweatshops or scrounging for discarded items on rubbish tips to help their impoverished and disempowered parents. So we need a bit of humour along the way, don't we? So there we go. And although this is a dig at the royal family, which is very much a part of all of this, you know, it's not just the royal family, but yes, we can certainly see the discrepancy in wealth between those that have and those that have not, you know, laid very starkly in front of us with the royal family. So, yeah, I've talked a bit about, I mentioned the City of London's grip on Parliament. Well, this is particularly through somebody who sits in the House of Commons called the City Remembrancer. Now, I'd not heard of the City Remembrancer until 2 or 3 years ago. Who's heard of the City Remembrancer? No? 2 people in the room. Okay. Well, it's only by reading an article about this in the Light paper, as I say, 2 or 3 years ago, that I heard about the City Remembrancer. This is a chap who, and it's normally a chap, of course, who is, well, I think it's probably only ever been a chap, who is the City of London's representative, and he sits behind the Speaker in the House of Commons. So this is somebody who's unelected, unaccountable, and he is, well, he's not accountable to us, he's accountable to the City of London. And what's he doing? He's making sure that all the legislation going through is in accord with what the City of London want. Yeah, I mean, that's how it is in this country, and just generally. So that's, you know, a big example of how the City of London controls the whole financial, the whole political side of things. And of course, politicians can be paid off and blackmailed and all of that sort of thing as well. And there's plenty of that goes on. And then what can these private bankers do? Well, they create the boom and bust cycle. So the classic example would be, in the 20s and 30s. So the central bankers, they can make money very plentiful, extend lending, there's a big boom in the economy, and this is the roaring 20s, right? So what does that create? Well, it creates real assets and resources. Business are built up, industry is creating real resources, there's resources being accumulated and so on. And then what the central bankers can do is that's good for them. They're lending all this money out and they're getting the interest back and so on. And then what they can do is they can contract the money supply, call in all those loans. Businesses go bust. If you're a home owner, inverted commas, you can't pay your mortgage, then the bank will repossess your house. So this is we've got the Great Depression. So this didn't come about by accident. These things never do. It was very much manipulated to create that, causing massive amounts of hardship. Of course, we know all the stories of the Great Depression and how that affected people's lives. And then what happens? Well, the bankers, they've lent all this money out, but what is money? It's just nothing, is it? It's just bits of paper. It's just figures in a computer. It's not real. It's not real assets. So when they manufacture a bust, they actually reap in all the real assets. So they repossess your house and they repossess businesses and so on. So they actually get what's most important, which is the real assets. Now, who's at the top of the financial system? The Bank of International Settlements. So who's heard of the BIS, or the Bank for International Settlements? Oh, a few more of you have heard of them. Yes. Well, I only heard about them really through Justin's work and the research he's done. So this institution is the central bank of all central banks. It's based in Basel in Switzerland. It's the top of the financial pyramid, and it was set up in the 1930s by Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, and the guy who's Hans somebody, I can't remember his second name, who became the finance minister for Hitler. So that says it all, doesn't it? These people who work there, they've got diplomatic immunity, it's exempt from paying taxes, it's a private institution, all the meetings and so on are held in total secrecy, it's unaccountable. But this is where all the money flows to. And what was going on during the Second World War? The Bank for International Settlements was operating there in Switzerland. Who was working there? There were Americans, there were British, there were French, there were Germans, you name it, across the board. So even though they were supposedly fighting each other and enemies, actually they all had people working in the, that's what the whole war was about, ultimately. It was making money, and that's all what wars... Well, wars have a multiplicity of reasons, geopolitical aims and so on, but the bottom line is always about making money. Well, along came this guy called Professor Carroll Quigley, who was a historian, and he managed to gain the trust of the central bankers and was allowed to attend some of their most secretive meetings. And as a result of that, became a whistleblower, and he wrote this book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, in 1966. Here's a quote from him. The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralisation of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. So well done, Professor Quigley, for getting that message out through his book, really, and it's still well worth reading. So what's going on now? We've got, as I said, we've got the move to a cashless society, central bank digital currencies, which I'm sure you all know is programmable money. It means if that comes in and cash is gotten rid of, the central bankers will have control over everything we do. We won't be able to access our money if they don't want us to access the money. Maybe we've not been a good girl or boy politically, so your bank account's frozen. Maybe if you go to an area outside of which, maybe if I come to Stroud from Devon and they don't want me coming to Stroud, they can say, well, you can't use your bank card or access your money while you're in Stroud. You have to stay in Devon, and so on and so on. If you haven't had your latest vaccine booster, well, you've got 2 weeks to have it before, we cut off your money or whatever it might be. They can program it how they like. And you can actually see, I'm sure a lot of you will have done this, Augustine Carstens, head of the BIS, and he's the classic Mr. Creosote. Have you seen this video? He's just enormous, this guy. He's like, he's blown up like Mr. Michelin Man or whatever. He's the ultimate fat cat, personified. And here he is saying very frankly to camera, and you can see this video, there is a huge difference, and he's talking about between CBDCs and cash. For example, with cash, we don't know who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who's using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control under rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability, and we will have the technology to enforce that. So the key words there are absolute control and technology to enforce that. So there it is in a nutshell, guys. It's all out there, on any topic. You don't have to go far and find this stuff. All you need to do is look, don't you? Thomas Jefferson. So we go back to the beginnings of the United States, as it supposedly is, before it was a corporation. If the American people ever allowed private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, so that's what he's talking about, the boom-bust cycle, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Sounds a bit like the Great Depression, for example, doesn't it? I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people for whom it properly belongs. So that was a big key part of what the War of Independence in the States was about. Why were the colonists, if you like, of the time wanting to get away from the British? It was because they were being taxed heavily, because the British monarchy wanted to pursue wars. They were having borrow money from the private bankers, how are they going to pay that back? They had to generate taxes. Well, they've got all these colonies. So they were, siphoning money away from the American colonies to pay for the loans that were owed to the private banks. And that's why we had things like that's how it all kicked off, really. That was a big part of it. So people like Thomas Jefferson, they knew exactly that they didn't want private central banks operating. And over quite a long time, there was a struggle between the two sides until finally the Federal Reserve brought about a decisive victory for the private bankers in 1913. Again, another little Bob Moran cartoon. And of course the media are all compliant in this, because they're all, the mainstream media anyway, because they're all corporate, entities. So let's talk about the Bradbury Pound. This is, as I say, something that's really unique to my book. It gives the history of this and lots of photos and stuff. One of the big reasons why I wanted to get this book out was because it tells this story which isn't covered in any of the other books on the money system, like John Hamer's book, for example. So how does this all come about? Well, 1914, at that point, the Bank of England notes, which are these promissory notes, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of, which are debt-based money, but money notes. They were, in theory, backed by gold at that time, which isn't the case now. Now, the British people knew that war was coming. It's pretty obvious. And they were getting jittery, and they wanted to exchange these worthless paper notes, ultimately, for their gold. So people started queuing up in droves outside the banks, demanding to exchange their paper money for gold. Now, of course, the bankers inevitably had issued far more paper notes than there was gold to back that up. So at this point, the private bankers, the central bankers, they were bringing about the war. They wanted the war to happen. They were manipulating things to create World War I. And as we said earlier, what was the big reason for that? Well, firstly, war is very profit-making. But there's many different reasons. You traumatize the people, you get geopolitical aims fulfilled, etc., etc. But the first thing is always through arms sales and lending money to governments so they can pay for their wars. It's always about making money. So the central bankers wanted the war, but at this stage they didn't want to run on the banks, and they were. They'd created a bit of a sticky thing for themselves. So what did the central bankers do? Well, they went to the government. Lloyd George was the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day, and the government just being their puppets. As I say, the politicians are bought off, they've blackmailed, so they're in the hands of the central bankers. So the central bankers went to the government and said, look guys, we don't want to run on the banks, so what we want you to do is issue your own money. And then what happened, that's exactly what happened. So the government declared an extended bank holiday for 3 days, so the banks weren't open, while the UK, the Royal Mint, the UK government issued its own money. This is interest-free, debt-free money. And then after 3 days, the banks reopened, and when people said, right, I want to exchange my Bank of England promissory note for gold, well, the bank said, we can't do that, but what we can do is give you these new notes issued by the government, and they had the signature of the guy who was the permanent secretary of the Treasury at the time, Sir John Bradbury. So because they had his signature on, they became nicknamed the Bradbury Pound. Now, what were these notes backed by? They weren't backed by gold, but they were backed by the credit, wealth and creativity of the nation. So in other words, enough money was put into the system to facilitate trade and the economy, but not too much that you get inflation, and not too little that trade can't occur. Does that make sense? As I say, this is debt-free, interest-free money, and fortunately for everybody involved at the time, this was accepted by the people. And as I say, it's backed by the what you might call the GDP, the gross domestic product, and that was at a set rate, a non-variable rate, unlike the value of gold, which goes up and down. And what this did was we've got an example in history. When this happens, this is what it leads to. If you do it well, it creates stability, it creates prosperity, at zero interest, full employment. So what then happened? Well, after a little while, I think about 3 or 4 months, the central bankers rushed back to the government and they said, well done, we've averted an economic collapse. The war is, kicking off, which is what we wanted. But now we want to make lots of money from this war. So we want you to stop issuing Bradbury Pounds. And gradually, over a period of time, the Bradbury Pound was, phased out, and the Bank of England money was brought back in. But there were Bradbury Pounds in circulation as late as 1926. And certainly for about a couple of years, we've got that period when we can see the effect of the Bradbury Pound and what it did. So it's no surprise that this whole episode in British history has been completely airbrushed out of history. And this is what this dying man wanted Justin Walker to know about, so we could get this information out into the world. So the book we've written together is a small way of being able to do that. Or maybe a big way. There's the Bradbury Pounds. So these were the emergency first batch, and you can see Sir John Bradbury's signature on them, and the notes are actually printed on one side only, on stamp paper. Justin's actually got an original Bradbury Pound, which is one of his most prized possessions, which he can show people just to show it. This is a real thing. This was actually happened. And it says, issued by the Lords Commissioners of Her Majesty's, or His Majesty's rather, Treasury, under the authority of Act of Parliament, blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't say the Bank of England. It doesn't say, I promise to pay the bearer on it. And that's the second batch of the Bradbury Pound. Look, there's the King's Head, and so on. Oops. There was also a number of other examples of sovereign money, as this is called, but probably the most famous was President Lincoln. So he wanted to win the Civil War, and he needed money to do that, to pay for his armies and so on. So he went to New York from Washington, and he spoke to the bankers there, and he said, "Can you lend me some money?" And they said, "Yeah, of course we can lend you some money for your war. Here's the interest rate, exorbitant interest rate." Lincoln said, "Stuff you. I'm just going to issue my own money." And in the 1860s, he issued the greenback dollar. Now, this was exceedingly popular, and the central bankers had a lot of difficulty getting rid of the greenback dollar. And believe it or not, there were still greenback dollars in circulation as late as the 1990s. So we're talking over 100 years. And it helped pay for the Union's victory in the American Civil War. And then what happened to Lincoln? Yes, there might be reasons why he was assassinated. So Justin's big thing really is that he's calling for a restored Bradbury Pound, which is a simple, effective, proven solution. Now, what I really like about it is if you have, you know, a restored Bradbury Pound, well, for ordinary people on the street, there's no real difference in terms of how everything operates. You know, it's something they can understand. There's notes and there's coins, there's figures in your bank account, but rather than that all being issued and owed to the Bank of England, it's issued by the government. It's actually your money. You're a part of this. So unlike, for example, cryptocurrencies, which most people can't understand and not interested in, this would be a very smooth transition if we bring about a sovereign money solution, either on a regional or a national level. And certainly that was the case in 1914.
Who's going to print it?
Well, let's get there. So if we had this, it's going to bring about a massive and positive transformation of the whole of our society, creating continuous stability and prosperity, rather than contrived boom and bust cycles that, as we know, trigger and cause austerity cuts, inflation and deflationary pressures, and a lot of stress amongst people as they worry about debt, especially amongst the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society. Well, so what's inflation caused by? So
because it's a closed loop system, right?
okay, so let me just say there's you and me. Who asked that question? Yeah.
Can you
So
just repeat the question for the camera?
yeah. So what was the question again? It was
Yeah, just so how would it not be?
how does in other words, how does inflation come about is the question really, isn't
Well,
it?
how would the Bradbury Pound not also be subject to inflation?
Well-
the government can just print as much as it wants.
Yes. Okay, so here we're talking about, what we're predicating this all on is the issuing authority, call it the government or whoever, is acting in the interests of the British people. Yeah? So that's what the whole thing is predicated on. Of course, the central banks are doing what they're doing for their own self-interest. So inflation is really good for them. So how does inflation come about? Okay, you've got £1, I've got £1. Okay, a loaf of bread costs £1. So you can buy that loaf of bread, I can buy that loaf of bread. Yeah, and we each own 50% of the wealth of our little nation, right? If the bank issues another £1, all of a sudden there's £3 in circulation, right? So all of a sudden the value of our holding goes down. We now, rather than owning 50% of the wealth of our little nation, we own a third, right? So that's going to mean that let me get this right. That's going to mean that the price of bread is going to go up. Does that make sense? Because if it just stays at £1, let me get this right here. I get a bit in a muddle with all of this sort of thing. Perhaps somebody else can explain it better. But
the value of the pound has decreased.
the value of the pound has decreased. So we need more money. We need more pounds to buy the bread. Yeah, or the bread, or in other words, the price of the bread goes up. Now, if the issuing authority puts enough money into the system, like they did with the Bradbury Pound, just to facilitate that trade, but they're not flooding the economy with too much money, and that's not starving it of money. They're just the right amount, yeah, which is what happened with the Bradbury Pound. Then you don't get inflation, and we can. This is what you know. The argument always is put forward with well, we can't have a sovereign money solution because you get hyperinflation, you know, and they talk about the Weimar Republic and all of these sort of things, trying to make out, oh no, it's impossible. It's impossible to have sovereign money. It has to be central bankers. It has to be private institution. No, it doesn't have to be private institution. Now, the thing is with all of this, which comes back to what you or somebody else mentioned earlier, with the big thing about this, and Justin's very clear on this as well, there's a big proviso with all of this, which I've already said. In order for the sovereign solution to work, you have to have some sort of central authority which is really acting on our behalf, right? Well, at the moment we haven't got that very clearly. As we've seen, the Parliament is supposedly acting on behalf, but it's completely beholden to the bankers and the corporations and so on. So, at the moment, a sovereign solution isn't viable really from that perspective. But in theory, it is there. But the main thing is, from my perspective, is that it shows, it underlines really how the fraud that's operating with the private and debt-based system. That's the key thing of it. And how simple it would be if we actually did have a central authority that were working on our behalf to create something, you know, that's completely different. And
but somebody has created the gold back somewhere.
yeah, well, hang on. Yeah. We're going to get to decentralised solutions in a minute.
Can I just
Yes.
have a quick one? How would it stop things being inflated by supply problems from abroad if there was a shortage of a certain commodity in the global market, or our economy became weaker for some reason, and the amount of imported goods and services from abroad, our sovereign Bradbury Pound has then got to buy things from overseas, and if the price of things from overseas goes up, they demands more Bradbury Pounds to import things, and then you're going to be importing inflation or having inflation exported to here.
Okay. Well, I completely understand what you're saying, and really, you know, when you get into the, I have to agree, when you get into the realities of this, it's a lot more complicated than I'm setting out. But I'm really just giving broad brushstrokes here. And yeah, then you get into all the detail and all the complexity of these things, which is a lot more complex today than it probably was in 1914 as well. Although possibly not, I don't know.
If we went down to more local levels, this sort of thing works.
Okay, so hang on, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. This is the sovereign money solution. We're focusing on this for a minute. Okay. So where have I got to? So we're just going to finish off on this. So Britain, as with any sovereign nation that kicks out the greed and criminality of the private central bankers, would become a country. This is really, you know, what Justin is. He's a strong advocate of this, as I say, and he's saying the country would become, would have lots of selfless entrepreneurs and inventors and people of real vision and ability who would seek nothing more than to make people's lives better and more fulfilling, whilst making a fair and reasonable return for themselves. So, we've got that, okay. But for me, you know, I'm into decentralised solutions and I'm into the gift economy. I'm an anarchist, right? I'm going to lay my cards on the table. But as I've said, I do think that the sovereign money idea is really critical, and that episode in history is really valuable because it just shows the lie that that we're given, that we're presented with.
Proves what they say is false.
Yeah, proves what they say is false, and proves very clearly that what the effects of a debt-based, interest-based money system are. So anyway, let's come on to decentralised solutions. And Buckminster Fuller's quote is a great way in here. Some of you may know this. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So this is all about creating a parallel society. What is a parallel society? Well, it's creating local systems and building resilience. That's the key thing, building resilience, running alongside the existing mainstream systems. And that's from a place of empowerment, not fear, and on the basis of creating a thriving society. So we just sidestep the existing systems as much as we can, whether that be growing our own food, creating our own energy systems. Well, it all is based on community, so that's where it begins. So, you know, build your community, have, you know, for example, very simple, you can start from a very simple level of creating potluck dinner evenings or having these community gatherings here, coming together to talk about these topics. Build your community, have social events and so on. Of course, along with this, we've got decentralised means of exchange. This is part of it as well. There's many options. As I say, this is all predicated on finding and connecting with and building your community. So we've got, for example, the UK-based Freedom Network, if we want to find who folk are in our local area. We've also got the, what are they called, the Freedom Cells, that Derek Brose and John Busher have set that system up, which is a worldwide situation to find people. They call it the Freedom Cell Network. So here's a few examples, or the main examples perhaps, of decentralised solutions. So the first one is the obvious one, barter. So Simon's got something that I want, I've got something that he wants, we just swap. But if I've got something that Simon wants but he hasn't got something I want, then we need to create, but B does, then we need to create a system where, you know, you can buy something from me and I receive something in exchange that I can then give to B. Maybe that's precious metals, maybe it's cryptocurrencies, maybe it's local exchange trading scheme tokens or LETS tokens. As I've said, I think really if we're looking at cryptocurrencies, it's certainly not a topic that I'm familiar with or have any technical detail on. But it does seem to me that the really good example of this, which I would recommend, because I know the people who've set it up and are operating it, who I totally trust and I think are very good people, is something called Quartal. And that's not just cryptocurrency, but it's an internet-based system and a whole sort of digital platform, if you like, across the board. Really interesting work that they're doing. Yeah, and there's examples of these different things and how they've been used, which are talked about in the book. So I'm not going to go into much detail on this. And this also gets talked about a lot by other people in other talks. You might have a whole talk on cryptocurrency, for example. Yeah, I mean, one example was in the 1930s, in the Great Depression in Austria. There was this one town that decided to create a local exchange trading scheme, and this actually started to create prosperity at the time when everyone was been down on their uppers, or whatever you call it, down on their, well, luck in inverted commas. Down on the, is that down on the uppers? Is that? No, I can't think what the phrase is, but you know, yeah, down and out. That's probably the phrase. They create this LETS scheme, and all of a sudden that started facilitating trade and was creating prosperity. And then other towns in Austria were saying, "Oh wow, let's do the same thing over here." So, you know, what did the private bankers do? Well, they managed to wangle some sort of legal case to get these things ruled illegal. You can't do that. Of course, they just paid off the judges or whatever. So these things were all shut down legally. But it just shows, you know, when you just step out of the mainstream system, you start doing your own thing, and just, you know, just ignore the mainstream. Well, as best as you can, anyway. And the more of us that do that, the better, really, isn't it? It's the classic anarchist slogan, their authority comes from our obedience. And here's a quote from Sean, what's his name? Sean Stone, that's it. Sean Stone, son of Oliver Stone. We want to be interfacing and interacting with folk we know and with whom ideally we have mutual understanding and principles, rather than contracting with people who are pirates and scoundrels such as banks. What gives them the right to create money? I also have the right to issue my own currency. There's currently a paradigm shift happening with finance and economics, which we can all become a part of. So, again, something that I came across the other day that I just thought I'd include because I like it, really like it. I've just tested positive for sovereignty. What are the symptoms? Critical thinking, bodily autonomy, speaking your truth, the gift of discernment, standing up against tyranny, advocating for our children, and socially distancing from the system. I love it, I love that. Okay, so I think it's time to have a little break. So my big passion, ultimately, is the gift economy. Now, let's have a look at this. So we've got this quote from somebody called Edo. We've all been given a gift, the gift of life. What we do with our lives is our gift back. What are gift economies? Well, they're societal systems. Hang on a sec. Gift economies are societal systems that operate. I'm not quite sure that's right, is it? But through exchanging gifts. Maybe it is right. Through exchanging gifts between parties. The gift is a voluntary transfer of goods and services, and this is the key thing, not requiring a compulsory transfer in return. Everyone has a gift. For example, you've got knowledge, you've got skills, you've got services, you've even got commodities that, if shared, could rapidly solve a pressing need elsewhere. People and organisations can get their problems solved or solve other problems. So we're all born into a gift economy, which is practiced by those that mothered us, enabling us to survive. So the economy of exchange, in other words, quid pro quo, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but it generally leads to more separation, more competition. It has that, obviously this is bigged up massively by those that want us to be separated and in competition. But it has that flavour to it, you know, in a small way initially. Whereas gift giving and receiving creates mutuality and trust. And the gift economy and its culture is a way to create peace and abundance for all. What are the two elements of the gift economy? It's generosity and gratitude. So really what we're talking about here is going back to how things were for most of the time in human society, which is not having money. And when I'm feeling abundant, you know, I've got lots of apples, I can give out my apples. Why would I want to hoard all my apples? These are mine, not yours. No, I want to share them with you. And by doing that, I feel good, and then you all receive the apples. You feel good, you feel nourished, and you feel valued by me, yeah? Now, I might have lots of apples, but I might not have lots of pears, right? So Simon's got lots of pears, he then shares that out. So that's the generosity, he's feeling generous, and people feel gratitude. when they receive. Now what that means is when I'm abundant I can give, but say there's a big storm and my house is blown down, by creating that mutuality and trust, people will feel naturally inclined to help me, rebuild my house when it gets blown away. And that's really the basis of society, it has been for so long in human history. And it's only in relatively recent times we've got more and more away from that. Now, I think a gift economy can work really well in the small knit community where you live, where you've got personal relationships with people, you know these people. So I don't think with any of this there's a one size fits all. We can have a basket of solutions. If we want to trade with somebody around the other side of the world, we might want to use cryptocurrency. If we want to trade with someone in the next town along, or somewhere else in the UK, we might want to use net schemes or precious metals, or we can have a basket of solutions. But for me, I feel that what I particularly want to create in my close-knit local community is this gift economy. What it does require is it's a bit of a shift in consciousness, really, from where we're at now, which is because we've all been so ingrained into being in competition with each other and thinking that there's never enough. So if I've got something, I want to hoard it and keep it to myself, and so on. So here's something I wrote which just really lays it all out in my head. It's called Real Wealth. Money isn't wealth. Possessions aren't wealth. Reputation isn't wealth. Real wealth is vibrant health. Real wealth is family. Real wealth is community. Real wealth is an abundant, thriving earth. Wealth is the gifts you have given. Wealth is the strength of your connections in the web of life. So that's really looking at the bigger picture of all of this. Money is just it's a man-made construct. It has its uses, it's a means of exchange and so on. It can get misabused or abused by adding usury to it and so on. It's a tool, but really what is real wealth? As I say, these are the things that are real wealth: health, family, community, an abundant, thriving earth. And I love this quote from Percy Bysshe Shelley, bit of poetry. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. There you go. Simple as that. We're in the majority here. If we just take back our power and get on with it and ignore them, they'll just, that system will just shrivel and die. We just disinvest from it, and the more people that do that, the quicker that will happen. So that's a visual image for that. Don't need to say any more. Here's my concluding remarks. It's time to see through this sophisticated deception, reclaim our power and sovereignty, reconnect with ourselves, with others, and with nature to create a truly magnificent world. Let's step into that paradigm shift. Just want to thank Bob Moran for the few cartoons of his I've put in. There's his website if you want to check him out. And there's my email and website, and obviously I've got the books as well. Very happy to receive any feedback or information or whatever you'd like to chat with me about on the internet, through the internet as well. Thank you very much, everybody. So, we've got a bit of time, haven't we?
Yes.
Yeah, for any questions, any discussion, comments, feel free.
What's the symbol, Daniel? I was thinking just that. Your little logo.
Oh, that's the Om symbol, the sacred sound of the universe. Well, it goes. It's a very ancient symbol.
We should do one. Let's do one.
Yeah, we could do one. You do want to start us off?
Yeah. Yeah. So the tone is A-U-M. Yeah? So just take a deep breath in and let it go. And inhale to Om.
Wow, well, thank you. That's the first time that's happened in one of my talks.
Amazing.